Good evening. My name is Keith O'Haron. I'm the urban forester for Union County. I've been here about a year and a half. Been an urban forester about 15 years. I've worked in the Chicago suburbs, Indiana, Texas, Virginia. But we're here and we're feeling pretty settled here now. So I'm pretty excited because the winters here are pretty, pretty, uh, pretty subtle compared to what we're used to. Um, so we are,
See how you
are
turn
we
it.
able to mute the people on the webinar?
They're not gonna, they're not muted. They're muted.
Okay,
Yeah, they are muted. They have muted themselves.
okay, all right. So we are here to talk about pruning trees for proper structure.
I can't hear.
Oh, someone's saying they can't hear on the webinar.
Okay, then I will work on that. That is probably there.
What QVC season?
It's not you, because other people can hear, so don't, yeah, I'll worry about
Okay.
it with them, yeah.
Down there where you like to, Lord mercy, I need to take my audio off.
I don't know. It says Cynthia Hunter is speaking.
Wait a minute. I got this thing. I'm off.
No, she's just talking.
Okay. All right. So, pruning trees is preventative maintenance. Let's see if I can move this as well. Sorry, we got a lot of technology going on here.
Stop that.
All right. Pruning trees should be thought of as preventative maintenance. So I get a lot of calls to look at trees, large old trees, that homeowners and landscapers are great at pruning trees up to lawnmower height. So tall enough that you can walk under it with a lawnmower. Then they forget about it for 40 years. And then they call me when there's a problem. And that's like not changing the oil in your car for 40,000 miles and then being surprised when the engine seizes up. So pruning trees can be thought of as preventative maintenance. Now, trees in the woods, like the right side of the screen, they take care of this themselves. For the most part, they have to grow straight up to compete for light. Their natural form is one single trunk with short, stubby branches that are pretty stout rather than long, overextended limbs. And so trees in the woods, again, kind of take care of this themselves. They've evolved without our assistance. But when we take forest trees and we grow them in the open, they don't have to compete for light, and so they get lazy. And so they grow up a little bit as we prune them for clearance that we can mow under them, but then they grow out, they grow sideways. And so this was the national champion sugar maple, but it had to be removed because of this huge overextended limb. You can see this is a giant crack. And so as this crack formed, it was actually wide enough to fit your whole hand in there before they removed it. This was exposing an entire side of the tree as a huge wound, and so that tree's gone now. That had to be removed. So trees in an open growing environment do benefit from our attention, especially if they're growing near targets where there's risk to life and property. And so again, I'm an urban forester, I'm an arborist, and so this applies to the trees that grow near our homes and schools and places of business and parking lots and commercial centers. So it's important to be proactive, not just reactive in that sense, because a lot of these problems can be prevented. So you can't really put nature in a box, though, and there's exceptions, right? So some species can tolerate this a lot better than others. So live oaks are exceptionally strong. I worked with live oaks in Texas for 4 years, and they amazed me. They amazed me every time I worked with them, how much stronger they are than most trees. But even this tree still needs a crutch that you see down there in the lower right. So this is actually a metal crutch that's supporting that tree limb because that's a low, overextended limb. Here, this kind of clumping of three trunks all joining at the same spot, those codominant leaders, that's something that we usually try to avoid as well. And we're going to talk more about that as we get into actually what cuts to make coming up here in the future. This is a ginkgo I came across at a cemetery in Kentucky, in Louisville. It's actually a cemetery and a certified or registered botanic garden, Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville. And this ginkgo is 9 feet in diameter. And you can see it has these huge trunks that start low. At some point in the future, that's going to fail. The longer a limb is, the more leverage and force, the more leverage can be applied and the more force can be applied onto that union where that branch meets that trunk. And that's often what kills trees, is a failure occurs, some large catastrophic failure that opens a huge wound that can't really grow over, and disease gets in there and decays, and that leads to someone deciding this tree is too much risk. And so again, we're talking about preventing these kinds of large failures from occurring in the first place. And we can accomplish that through pruning. And why would we do that? Why don't we just let a tree be a tree? Well, in the woods, that's fine. Let the trees do whatever they want. But near our homes, again, there's risk to life and property. Additionally, trees cost money. We spend a lot of money on the tree itself. There's labor and time, effort spent planting the tree, mulching it, composting it, watering it, all that investment. And by extending the service life of that tree, just like extending the life of your car, you're increasing the return on that investment. You're improving that financial investment, okay? Another reason is that large mature trees provide a much higher value than small trees. So the ecosystem benefits generated from 20 little trees that are 1 inch in diameter are nowhere near the ecosystem benefits we get from one tree that's 20 inches in diameter. They're not equal. It's more exponential. As trees get larger and fatter and more stout and more complex, the benefits they provide become more complex and greater. It's not an equal relationship. So large old trees provide much greater value than a bunch of little baby trees. There's also benefits that little baby trees don't provide at all, not just in small quantities, but zero. So things like deadwood, and other forms of wildlife habitat like cavities, nesting cavities, as well as character. Little baby trees really have no character. But great big old trees have a lot of character, and that's a lot of what we're driving toward. And we're not at risk of having too many large old trees. So these are a couple charts from traditional forestry, forest ecology in the woods. And so this graph in the upper right here is saying that the number of trees per acre of a certain size decreases as the size increases, okay? So visually this is represented here on the bottom where in the same space we have like 10 seedlings for every one big fat old tree with character and special properties like deadwood and nesting cavities. And the same concept applies in the urban area. For every great big old special tree, there are hundreds or thousands of little baby trees that provide less character, less ecosystem benefit per unit. So we're not at risk of having too many big fat old trees, but we should be striving toward that, whether that's your home or your municipality like the city of Monroe or your botanic garden. Again, it's about extending the service life, getting the most value out of that tree that you've already invested in, while also reducing risk to life and property. Again, these kinds of failures that I'm talking about, what happens is force structure leads to some kind of major failure, some kind of tear out, and either someone makes a decision right there and then that the tree is no longer viable, or that tree lingers for 10 or 20 years and dies a premature death as a result of that major failure that it never really recovers from. You know, this kind of failure that you see on the screen here, you know, this tree is never going to be able to really cope with this, and this is going to shorten the life of that tree. And wherever we see these kinds of major failures, there's some kind of structural defect, like codominant limbs, which in the context of what we're discussing here is a defect. Having 2, 3, 4, 5 trunks all meeting at the same union, that's a major defect, because that's going to rip out in a wind event, that's going to fail, and you're going to have these kinds of major failure and a large wound left behind that'll never grow over. This one was a codominant, so here's one of the trunks, and here's the other. One went one way, one went the other during a wind event. Another codominant limb in a large oak. This was in California, some kind of a ficus. So these kinds of things that we see in mature trees, some of this can be avoided. There's a lot of this is associated, a lot of the reasons that trees die are associated with cultural practices, poor soil, lawnmower damage on roots or the trunk flare. But some of it, a lot of it is structure that can be avoided through pruning. So this is an ash. Here, this is interesting. The discoloration there, the brown spot, is decay associated with rubbing, because the union between a trunk and a trunk is not overlapping tissue like a trunk and a branch. Instead of overlapping, they're just pressed together. And when the wind blows, those two trunks move independently of each other, and they rub, and they injure each other, and that never really grows over or heals. And so that's an inherently weaker union than the union of a trunk and a branch. And that's why arborists put in cables. When you see steel cables in a tree trunk up high, that's because there's a weak union down below that they're trying to keep from ripping out, as you see here in this photo. So again, trying to prevent a major failure from occurring. There are exceptions. So this is a great big Zelkova in DC, and we think of Zelkova as an exception, something that likes to have, 7, 8, 9 trunks. And that's not really the case. They come to us from the nursery like this. This photo on the right, zoomed up, shows, this is a Zelkova that's had basically no maintenance. It comes from the nursery with 9 trunks, and 5 years later, it still has 9 trunks. That's that kind of 4 branch spacing and a bunch of codominant stems that, you can imagine when this is 20 years from now, all those trunks are going to be growing into each other. There's going to be included bark, which leads to that discoloration that traps moisture, accelerates rot and decay. And so these are all going to be weak attachments. And this tree is just going to explode when it's about 20 years old and there's a real thunderstorm. So this is a real Zelkova in Japan, and it only has like 3 real trunks and a couple low limbs that it would rather have not have had in the first place. But so in nature, where we see Zelkova growing in nature in Japan, they really don't have 7, 8, 9 trunks. Elm is another one. When we think of an elm-lined street, we think of their really arching canopy and really interesting branch structure. We don't really plant a lot of American elm anymore. That's changing. What we do plant a lot of these days that I'm concerned about is lacebark elm. So these lacebark elms come to us from the nursery with a lot of problems already built in. So they come to us looking like this. You can see that union on the left. I mean, this tree is like 8 years old and it already has that major defect. That union on the left is a very tight union that's V-shaped, which is inherently undesirable. The one on the right is a little better. It's a little more broad and U-shaped, but as those two stems increase in diameter, that U-shaped union is going to become tight and V-shaped, and there will be bark trapped between the two as they grow together. And where you have included bark like that, again, you trap moisture that accelerates rot and decay, and that's going to fail. And what happens with these, I mean, this is right outside the government center in downtown Monroe. And so, you know, these are only like, I don't know, 12 years old, 15 years old, and they already have these major wounds. I mean, the one on the right is like, I can't believe they didn't remove it when they cleaned up that branch. This one on the left, so that was a major failure that ripped out. You know, neither of these is ever going to heal from this or recover from this. But we've already spent all this time and money and effort planting it and pruning it and maintaining it to get it to this point, but no one bothered to clip out a couple codominant stems. And so that's a lack of training. Landscapers are not trained for this kind of pruning that we're discussing. Again, landscapers prune a tree to 7 feet so they can get under it with a 0-turn mower with the roll bar up, and then they forget about it. Yeah, question?
Have had an injury, like something breaking off. The previous slide, where one on the left, at that age, would that be removed?
Yeah, good question. So the question is, you know, is it too late for this tree here on the screen in the photo? I would say that, you know, no, I don't think it's too late. And there's different methods to approach this. Because making this cut now, you're making like a 4-inch cut on a stem, not a branch, on a stem, and so that's pretty aggressive because the way that a tree compartmentalizes decay, it does a lot better compartmentalizing and resisting decay on branches than it does stems. And also, obviously, the smaller the wound, the better. But is it too late for this tree? You know, this is a street tree, obviously. And so, I mean, I've always been pretty aggressive with street trees. They need to conform, they need to have clearance. So otherwise this is gonna get ripped off by a garbage truck. So on a street like this, I would prune that off. I would rather that tree be forced to cope with a nice clean cut than a rip or a tear. And that's almost always the case. Now there is a compromise, and that is just a subordination cut. So what that means is, instead of taking the limb off at the trunk here, we would go about halfway up and just take off the top half of that limb. So you've reduced the end weight greatly. You've reduced the length of the limb, so you're reducing the amount of force that can be applied on this weak attachment. And also by subordinating it, you're stunting it. And so you're effectively freezing it in size, while the trunk next to it continues to increase in diameter. And so over time, that's gonna lead to a better or a less weak union. And so there is a compromise. And that is kind of a subordination cut that I just described. And we'll look at some more examples. Yeah. Any other
I have a
questions?
question. I have a question on that tree. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you just cut that limb or that stem,
Yeah.
don't you then leave a very broad open wound, almost like topping that branch?
Yeah, so the question is, isn't that basically a topping cut? In some sense it is, because you're cutting on a stem, not a branch. But you're not leaving a great big long stub. And so it may sucker to some extent, but you would clean those suckers off, and the tree will grow over that, or at least attempt to grow over that. And so, again, this is a situation where there's no great option. The correct option was pruning this off 6 years ago, but that didn't happen. And this is very often the reality that urban foresters and arborists and master gardeners and homeowners face is, well, there's decades of deferred maintenance, and now we have to make some hard decisions. So to answer your question, yeah, it is kind of an internodal cut. Well, it's not internodal like a topping cut, but it is cutting on a stem. And like I said, a stem is inherently less apt to resist decay than a branch cut. These are some more lace bark elms down at the government center. So for these, it's not too late. This one on the left, we have 3 codominants. So I would come in here and somewhere up in the canopy, I would reduce those by half. And so that's kind of the compromise, is you're avoiding making a huge cut on the trunk, but you are reducing the likelihood of that ripping out. And then on the right, this is actually pretty decent structure. It's just too low on the tree. You know, it's too low for that to be, you know, that's 3.5 feet off the ground. And that's a little low to have a major scaffold limb. You know, again, I come from like a city forester background where I think about street trees and clearance for like a garbage truck. Okay, like 14 feet or 16 feet. In a homeowner's backyard, if you want a major scaffold limb 3 feet off the ground, that's fine. I just wouldn't have 3 of them down there and all attached to the trunk at the same spot. And we'll talk about branch spacing coming up. So context is extremely important, right? Context of where it's located, what the species is, what your expectations are for the tree, and so on. So a little terminology. Some trees are inherently, they inherently have better structure than others. Better meaning they want to form one leader, while others, when they're open grown, instead of being in the forest, when they're open grown in full sun, they turn into a bush on a stick. And I'm thinking of maple. And this is kind of a continuum. It's not one or the other. So on the right side, a decurrent tree is maple, ash, elm. Can anyone think of any other decurrent trees? Any other trees that form a lot of trunks? Yeah, redbud. Redbud forms several trunks. How about on the left side, excurrent? Pine trees, yep, pines are definitely excurrent. Most oaks are pretty excurrent, except for live oaks, which are way over there on the right side. But they deal with it pretty well. Like I said, they're inherently stronger and denser than most other trees. Back here on the left side, tulip tree. sweet gum. I mean, this is a sweet gum. Like it's a shame that everyone hates the gum balls because sweet gum is a fantastic tree. I mean, it grows really straight with strong limbs, well attached, excellent fall color. I'm excited about some of the new fruitless sweet gum cultivars. I think if we can get rid of the gum balls, I think sweet gum is going to be a really fantastic urban tree. Tolerates poor soil. But so the point is, some trees need more attention than others, okay? So especially maples, lace bark elm, like we were just looking at, lace bark elm needs a lot of pruning. Zelkova. Yeah, and so on the left here, we have a strong structured tree with one dominant stem, one main trunk. However, where we get one of these low limbs that starts reaching up into the upper canopy, that needs to be either subordinated, like cut back halfway, or removed entirely at the trunk, because we really just want one main leader. We don't want several leaders. On the right side here, we have a tree with a weaker structure, a decurrent tree with 3 codominant stems. So you'd come in here and reduce the height on 2 of those, or eliminate them entirely to focus the growth on one main trunk. This is just kind of repeating the same thing. On the left is what I would call a good quality tree with one main leader. We have branch spacing that is well spaced. These scaffold limbs are well spaced vertically, and then also radially around the trunk, and we'll look at that later. I have a better graphic for that. Think of the spokes on a bicycle tire. You want the branches well spaced around the trunk. On the right side, this is poor structure. This is classic nursery tree with some attention by a landscaper and then forgotten. So pretty much all of these branches are originating at one point. And so when this tree, right now it's fine. It's not going to rip out when it's 5 or 10 years old. But when this tree's like 40 years old, all these branches are going to be crowded up. As these increase in diameter, they'll grow into each other, included bark, accelerated rot and decay. Major failure, tree has a shortened life, okay? So we'll get into a little more specifics. A lot of these slides, or most of them, are taken from Dr. Ed Gilman at the University of Florida, now retired. So this kind of poor structure that you see on the left really can't be mitigated at this point. We're not going to make this cut here. That's like a 20-inch diameter cut on a trunk, or you don't want to, because even if you make that cut and it's a clean cut, you're still, the tree's never going to recover from that, and you're shortening the life. And so these kinds of problems need to be corrected when they're like this size, 1 inch in diameter. And so you always need to be thinking ahead and applying preventative maintenance. And these are the kinds of defects that we are removing. Codominant stems, weak branch attachments, and we'll look at that, as well as large lower limbs. Yeah, question?
Can you show which one you would cut off, where you would cut?
Yeah, so this one on the right here, this is included bark. See how it's turned inward instead of outward? There's no branch bark ridge. And so this is an inherently weak attachment because the bark is turned in. And so if this is the main stem here on the left, we would cut this branch off here on the right. And so we'd come in here probably about here. Hold on, Macintosh. Probably make this cut right about here. If we can get lower, great. but we don't want to injure this trunk tissue if at all possible. So if we have to leave a small stub up there, I'd rather leave a stub than injure the tissue on the trunk that we're not cutting off. So these are some of Ed Gilman's photos. So he's showing the difference in structure between two live oaks in the same parking lot. On the left here, we have two main trunks, and each of those trunks has further trunks. Oh, hold on. Each of those trunks has further trunks, whereas this one on the right is more of a forest tree. One main trunk with a slightly better branch spacing. This is still a little crowded right here, but this is closer to the ideal, even with a live oak. This is closer to the ideal of what we should be striving toward. This is going to be stronger attachments, better tree. This is going to be a much longer lived tree and better resist a wind event. And again, why are we doing this? Well, here are some more reasons. Fewer branches means less pruning. Well-spaced branches means easier access for arborists, and the pruning can be done faster. So early structural pruning in a tree, early in a tree's life, means less maintenance when the tree is larger, which is much more expensive. So you're extending the service life of the tree, and you're also saving money. So the way that I approach pruning young trees is by setting a budget, okay? So if a tree is really vigorous, it's established, it's healthy, I might go as aggressive as cutting off up to 50% of the live growth on a tree. In the Chicago suburbs, in my last job, there were a lot of maples. They did really well there. We would prune off up to 50% of their live growth, and they wouldn't even flinch. I never shocked a maple by over pruning it. I never happened. If a tree is, a bit more tenuous, not terribly well established, but you still need to make a couple pruning cuts because you don't know when you're going to come back. Maybe you're only cutting off more like 10% or 25%. But so in any pruning event, you kind of set that budget based on the species and site conditions and the health of the tree, the condition of the tree, and figure, how much do I think this tree can tolerate? And that threshold is usually between 25 and 50%. And so then we move forward with that budget in mind, and we prioritize in a certain order. And this is that order. So you start by pruning off dead, dying, diseased, damaged, or dang limbs, which is clearance. Okay. So if it's, if it's growing toward the gutter or the eave of the house, or you have to get under it to mow, or you don't want it to get ripped off by the mail truck, something like that. Step 2 is to select and establish a central leader, and eliminate entirely or subordinate all other leaders. Sometimes that's as far as you get, and you've spent your entire budget, and you don't get to step 3 or 4 or 5 until you come back in a year or 2 or 3, or if you're a municipality, every 5 years. So, pruning street trees, in my last job, we had a really well-funded program, but that still meant only pruning trees every 5 years. We had the city broken up into 5 sections. We'd prune one section every winter, one of the 5 sections. So that meant trees only got pruned every 5 years. That's another reason that we were very aggressive with them, because we would rather be aggressive because we knew we weren't going to make it back for 5 years. So if you don't fix the problem today, by the time you come back in 5 years, it's going to be that much larger, and the cut you have to make in 5 years is going to be that much of a bigger wound. So we'd rather get aggressive. So again, sometimes you only get to step 2 and you've spent your entire budget, okay? But that is part of the beauty of the subordination cut that we mentioned earlier, where instead of making that cut all the way at the trunk, you just cut half the limb off. So instead of spending your whole budget on removing leaders, you subordinate those leaders and reduce the competition with the main stem, and you save some of your budget to make some other pruning cuts today. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of a compromise. You're still dealing with the competition between two competing stems by removing part of one of them instead of the entirety of one of them. And that saves you more budget to spend on pruning today. So step 3 is select and establish the lowest permanent branch. So the lowest scaffold branch. Pick which branch on this trunk is going to be the lowest one. And then everything below that is a temporary branch. And you're either going to remove it today, if budget allows, or you're going to at least stunt it by subordinating it. And then above that lowest permanent branch, you select and establish the other major scaffold branches that you're gonna keep. That this is gonna be a permanent branch for this tree's entire future. And we'll look at proper branch spacing and talk about that. And then step 5, select temporary branches below that lowest permanent branch, and like I said, either prune or remove them. So this is pretty simple: dead, damaged, diseased branches, dead wood clearance. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Step 2, select and establish a central leader. So on the right side here, you can see this is that same kind of tree where we have these lower limbs that are reaching all the way into the upper canopy. So instead of growing out, these limbs are growing up. So they're competing with this being the main leader. So we want to, this is an example of a subordination cut. So you see how they're not making that cut at the trunk. They're coming out and only cutting, 3/4 of that limb off. So that's what we call a subordination cut. These buds, they all have hormones in them. And these hormones tell this, there's different hormones or greater concentrations in a terminal bud, a top bud, than a side bud. By removing this terminal bud that has that hormone in it, you're telling this branch that it's no longer top dog, it's no longer competing. And that's what it means by subordinating. Okay? So you're not just removing plant material, you're actually changing the plant growth hormone composition in that limb. Yeah. Yeah, we can do that. And so this is where these kinds of cuts come in. And so on the left here, this is a reduction cut, okay? Whereas on the right is a heading cut or a topping cut. And the difference here is that on the right is what we call internodal. And we want to avoid that. This is really not appropriate because you're leaving a stub, and it's internodal because it's between this node and this node. You're not cutting back to a lateral. Whereas here you are cutting back to a lateral. This is the lateral that should be, this diameter should be at least 1/3 in size of this diameter, okay? That's our rule of thumb. Always cut back to a lateral 1/3 the size of the cut you're making. Here's an example. So this lead, this low limb was growing into the upper canopy and competing with the main trunk. And so this person has made a reduction cut and subordinated that limb on the right side. If she would have cut it off at the trunk, she would have used her entire budget for the day and she wouldn't have been able to make any other cuts. But because she made that subordination cut, she can come back later and make that final cut on the trunk at a later date. And that, because she subordinated it, she's freezing that trunk, that side branch on the side, freezing that in size. And so the pruning wound she'll make in a few years is the same size as the pruning wound she would have made today. So she saved herself budget to use today, and she also bought herself a few years. And so this is just showing, this is a pretty standard tree that has really never had any pruning maintenance. And the idea is that by making these kinds of subordination cuts, you're freezing these in size, but again, the plant growth hormone then diverts into the main leader, and you're actually reprogramming that tree to channel its growth and effort into that main leader that you're trying to focus on. This is saying keep side branches half the size of the trunk diameter where it attaches or less. We don't like big, beefy branches that are approaching the same diameter as the trunk where they attach. And that's because we know that 20, 30, 50 years in the future, that's a failure. And that's going to shorten the life of that tree. This is just showing that same kind of a reduction cut. So this leader is being reduced here. So that cut was made there. Same thing here. This lead on the left is being reduced. Instead of being taken back all the way to the trunk, he's just stunting it by making that subordination cut. And so this is Ed Gilman again with those live oaks in the parking lot, getting pretty aggressive with them, kind of training them to one main lead. And then 2 years later, he comes back and that tree didn't even flinch. And it's ready for another aggressive pruning. Like I said, again, so step 3 is select and establish the lowest permanent branches. So again, a lot of my training is as a city forester, and I think about street trees a lot. And so when I look at a young tree that I'm planting as a street tree, every limb on that tree is a temporary limb. And in 20 years, every one of those limbs is going to be gone. Because, again, we go back to this photo. Here are these great big American elms on this left side here. I mean, the first major limb here is like 20, 25 feet off the ground. And that's what street trees look like. That's very akin to a forest tree. That's consistent with their programming. Because again, when you take a tree, a forest grown tree, and you grow it in the open, they get fat and lazy and they grow sideways. And that's not ideal for long term. Again, street trees, really don't have lower limbs. Those are intentionally pruned off. I'm not saying I want trees that are 80, 90 feet tall and like a stick, but they don't have lower limbs. And that's intentional. So again, step 3 was to establish the lowest permanent branch. So on this tree, we're saying it's here. We like the angle of that branch. We like this angle where it attaches between the tree and the trunk. We'll look at that. And everything below that is temporary. So all these temporary limbs are either going to be cut back, subordinated, or removed entirely. And so as far as angle goes, really the ideal branch angle is between 45 and 60 degrees. And so we've shown that through testing. Literally, people have used a come along to rip branches off of trees to see which branch angle is the strongest branch angle. And the answer is between 45 and 60 degrees is ideal to resist a wind event. This also shows the kind of branch spacing. Ideally, perfect branch spacing would look kind of like rungs on a ladder that you could easily climb. And then also think about the radial spacing around the trunk. Oftentimes you see 3 limbs clumped up right next to each other, and that's fine on a little baby tree. But again, as those increase in diameter, that structure becomes excessively complex as they grow into each other, and you get included bark, premature failure, premature tree death. So then step 4, select scaffold branches above that lowest permanent branch, and all the others are temporary, reduce them or eliminate them. And then step 5 is those temporary branches below, either reduce or eliminate them. So in summary, so you develop and maintain a central leader, identify the lowest branch, the lowest permanent branch. The low branches that are growing too large in diameter relative to the trunk where they attach should be stunted in size or removed entirely. Consider the branch spacing. Remove branches that are competing with those main branches or that have a poor angle of attachment or have included bark. Keep the branches that are less than half of the trunk's diameter, and then suppress the growth on those branches that are included bark or remove them entirely, because those are inherently weak attachments. Again, just showing the reduction cut versus a topping cut, and the difference there is that we're cutting back to a lateral. And so in practice, this is what that looks like. You might be left with something that looks like this. In this case, you know, we might say, well, we actually want to keep this side limb, so maybe we make this cut if that were 1/3 the size of the trunk here. It's not quite that, but if it were. Otherwise, maybe we want to keep this right side and remove this left side. And so we make this cut here to eliminate one of those codominant stems and keep that right side. Again, that's a bigger cut than you'd rather make, but that means that you should have been there before. And so again, there's a way to cope with that, and we discussed that. That's the subordination cut, right? Where instead of making the entire cut, making the entire limb go away, you're just taking like half of it and stunting it. This is a bit of a mess. So, you know, in a case like this, you might keep this one because this is stout, this is strong, and maybe you make this cut, but then this guy is too close to this, so maybe you make that cut as well. A little bit, that's young trees. Any questions about young trees before we look at, I just have like 3 slides on mature trees. Any questions about pruning young trees for proper structure? Pruning trees that are too close together. You know, it depends on context. I mean, eventually they would shade out those lower limbs as the canopy keeps growing. I mean, in the woods, trees grow into each other and lean on each other during a wind event. And that's, you know, that's part of their strategy for resisting a wind event. You know, in your yard, yeah, maybe you prune them away from each other. You know, I don't know that that's critical. Kind of depends on what exactly you're looking at.
Not have low limbs, but the tops have a lot of branches. What would it make sense to trim some of those branches?
Yeah, you know, again, a lot of trees come to us from the nursery with one main trunk for the first 4 or 5 feet, but then the way they prune them at the nursery is to put on girth. And so they basically top them. And when they're extremely young, they can tolerate that to an extent. They can tolerate internodal cuts. That keeps them from being too tall and limby and leggy. And so they kind of almost hedge them or top them back. But what that means is that they force a lot of growth low on the limb. Once that's planted in the landscape, you want to relieve the tree of that. And so that basically means, like I said, picking your lowest permanent limb and removing those below it, and above that, thin them out. So, I mean, from what she's describing, that tree probably needs to be thinned out. I mean, every tree that gets planted by a developer needs attention. Or by a landscaper or by a homeowner. I mean, all young trees need some pruning if they're going to be open grown, like a front yard. So just a couple things on mature trees. Again, here you're just kind of pruning for clearance on that lowest permanent limb and the limbs above. The major thing to avoid on mature trees, and when I say mature, I mean a tree whose structure is pretty much set, good or bad, whatever structure that tree has, it is what it is. Like you're not gonna make a 20-inch diameter cut or something. And so you're just mitigating what exists. The major thing to avoid is lion's tailing. So when arborists do it, it's because they're too lazy to get out to the ends of the branches and actually reduce some end weight and make subordination cuts. So they just clean out the interior, and they even use words like clean out and sell that as high quality pruning. And so what this does, and this is an example of lion's tailing, cleaning out the interior of the canopy, and they'll say, well, now the wind can blow through it more easily and it won't catch like a sail. And well, really what you've done is you've left a wad of leaves on the end, and all the branches between the trunk and the leaves are gone. And so instead of having those branches to attenuate shock and almost like shock, instead now it's going to whip. Now it's going to be able to whip more freely. And so the result of lion's tailing is often the longer a limb is, the more likely it is to just whip itself so hard it snaps in half during a wind event. So just be aware of lion's tailing. Homeowners are often also guilty of this because you can only reach so high with your pull saw. And so you prune what you can reach, which is kind of what you see here, just kind of the interior, the middle of the canopy. You don't reach the ends, so you don't do it, and you accidentally lion's tail your tree, okay? And so this is something to be aware of with mature trees. A mature tree that's had a lot of deferred maintenance, you want to basically apply the same principles that we talked about, but instead of making cuts on the trunk, you're almost envisioning every major limb as its own small tree and applying those same principles to each major limb. So you can reduce the length of limbs and reduce end weight, which reduces the amount of force on bad unions, bad attachments, or remove them entirely. Just a little bit about proper pruning cuts. Here on the left, we have one that has a good visible branch collar. And here's that branch bark ridge. So we never want to cut into this because this collar is where you have trunk tissue and branch tissue overlapping. That's why you get that ridge, okay? And you don't want to cut into that because you'd be injuring trunk tissue, the tissue of the trunk that you're leaving behind. So you you want to come outside of that collar and make that cut. That way you're only injuring branch tissue. And this is consistent with the tree's evolution because branches are designed to be shaded out and drop in the woods. Inherently in nature, that's part of their programming. And that rot and decay from that wound tracks back into the trunk, but the tree has mechanisms built in, chemical resistance, to isolate that decay to that branch tissue. And that is what, when you look at a wooden plank and flooring or any piece of wood cabinets, and you see a knot, that's what a knot is. That's a branch. And that's a branch that was dead. And when it dies, the tree floods it with chemicals to basically, in a sense, like mummify it and keep it from decaying excessively. Okay. This on the right side is the same as we saw much earlier on that little elm where you have included bark. And so as low as you can get here, you want to make that pruning cut down here because there is no branch bark ridge. But like I said earlier, you might not be able to get this low for a variety of reasons. You might not have a tool that can make a good clean cut that low. I have a friend who, he's a climbing arborist and he keeps a Leatherman on him, and that Leatherman has a tiny little wood saw on it that's 2 inches long. Sometimes he uses that to make tiny little cuts. But you wouldn't do that when it has all the weight on it. And so you make a different kind of cut. You make a 3-step cut, and I'll show you that. The 3-step cut avoids this. This is ripping and tearing. And so if you're trying to make a cut, if you're trying to cut a limb and it still has all that end weight on it, when you get to that about 80% done, it's going to start to break and it's going to rip and tear, and that's like tearing a fingernail on your finger, and it just rips out that flesh. And so we want to avoid this because this is a major wound that's really never going to grow over terribly well at all. That's not going to heal up. That's going to be a source of rot and decay. So the way to avoid that is first you make this kind of this 1 and 2 to take that end weight off, and then you're left with a stub that's just a foot long or 2 feet long, and you've taken all the weight off. You've taken off like 95% of the weight. So now you can more easily make a nice clean cut, step number 3, without all that tension, okay? And this is called the 3-step cut or a snap cut. And so you start by making an undercut where you see the number 1. You cut on the bottom side of the limb, about 10 to 20% is really all you need. And then you make cut number 2 on the top of the limb. And so you either come outside, as you see here, further away from the trunk, or you can even come back so that they're almost stacked on top of each other is also acceptable. Just never behind. You don't want cut number 2 to be closer to the trunk than cut number 1. You can stack them on top of each other or leave a couple inches like you see here. And so when that number 2 approaches number 1, they'll snap off. And so this is an example of that. You can see how it makes a nice clean snap. And now you've taken off all that weight. And so now you can make a nice finishing cut number 3, without all that weight, all that tension. And so that's how you avoid this. This is a big no-no.
Where would you make your final cut?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so the question is, on this photograph here, where would we make cut number 3? So you would make cut number 3 right about here. Yeah. Yeah, and not so much you might have thought like this. That would not be correct. You'd wanna cut it, parallel to the plane of growth. So this would be the smallest wound. And that's why, because you're creating the smallest wound. If you were to cut more so up and down, you're not injuring any different tissue, trunk versus branch, but you are creating a larger wound that the tree has to grow over. So by cutting it parallel, you're creating the smallest wound possible. So this tree, this is a red maple, here in Union County, pretty classic. It has, like 4 trunks. You can see the homeowner gave it some attention when it was young so that they could get under it with the lawnmower, and then they forgot about it for 20 years. Does anyone have trees like that? So this is a close-up of the trunk, the major union here. So we're not actually gonna address that. We're not gonna make those cuts. I decided we're gonna leave that as is. And I'm doing that because these are nice U-shaped unions. They're not tight V-shaped unions. They don't have included bark. We can see that branch bark ridge where the branch tissue meets is pushing out. It's not folding inward. So still not ideal at all. I'd much rather this had 1 trunk, but here we are dealing with someone else's deferred maintenance. So instead, looking up into the canopy and looking where this tree's gonna grow over the next 20 years, toward this house. So looking at these limbs. And so this is just an example. So this is like this lead here. This lead here has, some competing codoms. And so we're gonna make this cut here to reduce this. Ultimately, what I want is, even though this looks like it's growing sideways, this bit here is actually growing up pretty nice and away from the house. So we're gonna prune for that. This bit, we're gonna prune that off. That's that 3-step cut you saw earlier. So now here, this guy's gone. We're left with these 2 competing against each other. We're gonna come up here and reduce that top. And that's that, but we left that was that reduction cut to a lateral 1/3 the size. And now you can see that we've selected for this part that's growing up. And we've done the same on all these leads, all these tips have been reduced like that. And what you're doing by doing that is all those unions, instead of being equal sizes, you've picked one or the other. You've made some decisions. And so in 20 years, instead of having, 20 unions that all have codominant stems, instead you have much fewer those kinds of competing codominant stems. Okay, you've selected one or the other. Yeah, question? They don't live terribly long, but even in their short lifespan, I see them rip out. I see failure in red buds, even in a 20-year-old red buds. So it's not necessarily about their lifespan. I mean, we have a red bud right outside here that has a major failure, because it has poor structure, because no one pruned it since it was planted in '07, So, yeah, I would still apply this to red buds. Smaller trees like that, they have not the same kind of forces applied to those unions that we see in larger trees. It's a different magnitude, but they do still benefit from some proper pruning. Right. Sure. Yeah, I talked to a lot of, yeah, the question is, what's up with crepe murder? Crepe murder is basically applying, shrub pruning principles like hedging to a tree. So you're basically treating a tree like a shrub. Crepe myrtles are pretty tough and they can tolerate it better than some trees, but they still don't tolerate it terribly well. I see people crepe murder their trees so hard that they die. They don't come back in the spring. And we're also seeing a lot more crepe myrtle bark scale. And so every time you top your crepe myrtle, you're stressing it out because it has to regrow all that plant matter that you hacked off. And so it's depleting its reserves over and over and over, which leaves it stressed and vulnerable to insects like crepe myrtle bark scale. So is it proper? No. I'd really prefer that people treated crepe myrtles like trees because they are trees. They're not shrubs. They don't tolerate internodal cuts like hedging um, very well. I mean, some shrubs. I mean, I follow a guy on LinkedIn who he has an entire career out of hand pruning boxwoods, and he firmly believes that hedging a boxwood is it's the same as crepe murder. And his entire career is he goes into boxwoods and makes individual cuts the size of pencil lead, and his boxwoods look a lot better than your boxwoods. I mean. They're a lot healthier because they're not constantly stressed from all those those internodal topping cuts. Um, and so he goes to formal Victorian gardens and botanic gardens and fancy places and gets paid to pamper boxwoods and other shrubs. Um, so yeah, I mean, he would say that I mean, shrubs are just small trees and they're woody. And so even they don't want topping cuts. Some tolerate it better than others, but then it's like, oh, why do we have boxwood blight, and why are all the boxwoods, turning to heck around here? Well, maybe because we're topping them once a year. Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Yeah, so the question is about leaving deadwood. I mean, so we call standing deadwood snags, and they have excellent wildlife value. Um, Yeah, owls, woodpeckers. Yeah, and so even at the city of Austin, we would leave snags, or we would, when we were removing trees in the parks, we would intentionally leave standing stumps. And so intentionally create snags for wildlife value. And we would measure, like, well, here's the walking path 16 feet away from this stump. So let's cut the stump to 14 feet. So even when it does topple over, it's going to fall a couple feet short. And so we went out of our way to leave standing deadwood. And then on the ground, it's also extremely important. I hear a lot of comments from homeowners and HOAs about things looking icky or messy or, brushy. They complain a lot about underbrush. And it's like they're talking about pollinator plants like wildflowers and grasses. They're talking about native shrubs, and they're talking about coarse woody debris, which is fallen deadwood, which has a lot of ecological value, a lot of ecological richness. And so all those things should be, promoted wherever possible, in my opinion. I think that's all the slides. Does anyone have any other questions?
Thank you, Keith. Awesome job.
Thanks, y'all.